have said it best. This administration needs to stop its effort to cram down yet again another new round of taxes and spending. Period. We have time for a couple of questions before we have to go. Yes, we'll go here and then here.
So what is your response to President Biden's statement today, noting that the core inflation numbers have come down and that these numbers are outdated given the recent draw in gas prices?
Well, first of all, look at the chart. The chart tells it all. He said that same thing when I put this similar chart up months ago. It hasn't changed. Yeah, there's been a small tick down in the gas prices, but they are still the major driving force here, and they're still above $5 a gallon. I think the answer is the president needs to stop looking for excuses and start focusing on the right kinds of policies that my colleagues have described here in terms of fixing and addressing the inflation crisis. Yes?
So there's reports that the Biden administration is considering rolling back the tariffs on China. Do you think that that's the right approach to handle the situation?
You know, that's one that I am continuing to negotiate with the Democrats, and I'm not going to weigh in on any specific outcome of those negotiations right now, but I'd be glad to, if any of my colleagues want to jump in on that. This is a heavy item of negotiation right now between the parties.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that Senator Crapo was in the middle of that because it is very complicated. But the bottom line is there was a report called a Section 301 report that was done on China's practices with regard to trade, and it was determined that China was not playing by the rules, was subsidizing with dumping and other unfair trade practices, and therefore these tariffs were put on. China has not changed its behavior. And in fact, the Phase 1 agreement that was negotiated between the previous administration and China has not been fully implemented as a result. So my concern is that we don't want to send the message to China and frankly to other countries around the world that when countries are found to be unfairly trading, there's not going to be a consequence. And when they make a commitment to do something, as they did in Phase 1, and don't complete it, that we should not reward that. So my hope is that we don't do a wholesale elimination of the tariffs, but rather look at it on a case-by-case basis, which we did during the last administration and do not do in this administration, which is they have what's called an exclusion process, where, as an example, if the product being imported from China is not otherwise made here in the United States, that might be a good candidate for reduction or even elimination of that tariff because it's not helping American workers. But on other products, where there's direct competition with American workers and where it's being unfairly traded, that's not a level playing field for American workers. I think we have to be very careful there. Also, I've looked at the impact on inflation that it would have, and it's minimal. It's minimal. Having said that, again, I appreciate the fact that Senator Crapo is in the mix there. I know he understands all these issues, and we need to come up with a good balance.
I'll just make a quick comment on that as well. It's ironic. The Biden administration says we're struggling to be able to produce enough oil, and so let's go to Saudi Arabia and get more oil. We're slowing down on manufacturing, and so let's go to China to get more manufacturing. If there's any lesson that we should have learned during the time of COVID is that we cannot be dependent on the communist Chinese government on our supply chain. And this president that repeats over and over again, let's do made in America, is now trying to be able to deal with the inflation problem that he has caused and his policies have caused by going to China to be able to make us even more dependent on China long term. We need to have a policy that does work towards making things in America, that deals with the regulations that he doesn't want to reduce, that deals with the production issues that he doesn't want to deal with. He should make it easier to produce in America, not easier to be able to actually go get from China. That's a better long-term solution for us. So he's trying to solve a real problem that he's created by creating an even bigger problem for the United States long-term, running back to China to be able to resolve this problem now. So let's resolve it by dealing with the regulations here and ask the simple question, why are we going to China to get something done when we should be actually asking the question, why can't we do it here? Let's deal with the regulations that would actually resolve it here.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hey, I just wanted to add on to this because you guys talked about how inflation is in your communities. Is this the number one thing that you guys think people are taking to the polls to vote on in the midterm?
I can speak for Idaho, and the answer is yes. It's their number one issue by far. And in fact, if you look at the number 2, 3, and 4 issues, they all connect and relate. The people of this country understand how an economy works, and they understand why this economy is in an inflationary spiral upward. and they want us to address it with the kinds of reasonable solutions that Senator Portman just went through. They want us to address the supply side. They want us to address the overregulation. They want us to stop throwing gas on the fire. And, maybe you should talk about Ohio, but in Idaho, the answer to your question is yes, this is number one.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. I mean, people are smart. They get it, and they understand that this was as a result of some policy changes that were made, in addition to, on the supply side, the obvious issue of COVID. But we knew that going into, the post-COVID, intense COVID period, and instead we did just the opposite of what we should have been doing in terms of increasing supply. So adding more regulations, threatening to add more taxes, and sending a strong message to our energy sector that we were going to stifle production in this country, as we're now starting to look overseas for production, which is interesting because by shutting down Keystone on day one, billions of dollars of investment, by saying we're not going to approve new leases on federal lands or water, by saying that we're going to restrict permitting, including through the waters of the U.S. regulations. These were all things that were done by the administration. And by the way, consistent with the campaign, where they said we're going to do all we can to discourage the production of fossil fuels. All these things add up. People get that, and they see it, and they see the result at the gas pump, and they see that that's what they find at the stores. And when they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet at the end of every month, people are just in shock by these increased costs. Particularly, as I said, the middle and lower income Americans who I represent, who don't have any buffer in the budget. Like, that's it. There's not a couple $100 lying around, much less $8,300 a year. People on fixed income, seniors, they're really having a tough time. One thing that hasn't been mentioned today that I think should be is that this started really with an overstimulation of the economy. It was, as Senator Crapo just said, putting fuel on the fire. And this was in March of last year, so 15, 16 months ago. And at the time, a number of us said, look, the outside analysts and the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan here in Congress, are all saying the same thing, which is this economy's taken off on its own. In fact, CBO said that by June 30th, mid-year, we'd be back to a pre-pandemic economic growth level. So the economy was already improving. And we warned that if you do this massive amount of spending, $1.9 trillion, most of which had nothing to do with COVID, the biggest spending bill by far Congress ever passed, more stimulus than ever, that you're going to overheat the economy and risk increasing inflation. It wasn't just us. It was also famously Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, and other Democrats who were looking at this objectively and saying, from an economic point of view, this doesn't make sense. There was an alternative. You may remember that a bunch of us went down to the White House, Republicans, 10 to be precise, which is enough with 50 Democrats to have passed something and said, here's our proposal. Let's focus this just on the issue at hand, which is COVID, shrink this down substantially and not make it a stimulus package. We were rejected. In fact, the day after our meeting was the day that Senator Schumer made an announcement that they were going to do the $1.9 trillion under reconciliation, where they needed 0 Republican support. So I will say, when you look back over time and how we got to where we are, we have to acknowledge the fact that this was a deliberate policy decision that was made, and it's resulted in these numbers that are just overwhelming for the people I represent.
On that same thing, some of them have been talking about a need for potentially more COVID stimulus specifically, whether that's to increase vaccines, anything. If the administration asks for that, do you think there's anybody on your side of the aisle that would approve or would be in support of more money for COVID relief at this point?
Is this like
Yep.
Yeah, the answer is yeah. I'm not a part of that group, but maybe are you working with?
I mean, there was a proposal, as you know, put out by a bipartisan group, including Senator Romney representing Republicans, saying we can pay for it out of the ARPA funding, the American Rescue Plan funding. I mean, every town and city in America is making announcements recently about how they're using their ARPA funds. I challenge you to do a story on it because you'll find that very little of it has anything to do with COVID. I mean, it's fine projects. It's a new city park, or it's something that has to do with infrastructure, which we funded generously now through the infrastructure bill. But there's just a lot of money that was put out that could be repurposed for this. And there was an agreement, you recall, between Senator Romney and I believe it was Senator Schumer. Anyway, there's an issue right now as to new money, but not as to repurposing existing funds, and there's extra funding out there. So I think that's where you could see a bipartisan compromise.
And Rob reminds me of a couple of points I want to make. One is this discussion that has been going on, and there has been a discussion about that need. It's a much smaller discussion, COVID-related, and it is offset. It is not new spending. And that kind of discussion is something worthwhile. If there are things needed on COVID that need to be done. Rob correctly pointed out the fact that there are hundreds of billions of dollars of that 1.9 trillion that have not yet been spent out, and that we are trying to find ways to get that redirected or clawed back so that we can stop this overstimulation. The other point I want to make, just remake, is this chart is not that old $1.9 trillion bill. This is the new proposal to pile on top of what we've just been talking about, and this is taxes only. There will be spending matching this. Now, Senator Manchin has said maybe the spending will only be half of this, but the point is there's another huge hundreds of billions of dollars of spending being proposed in the cram down that Senator Schumer is currently pursuing, which is not just the taxes. Today's discussion in this news conference is focused on taxes, but matching this is another huge mistake in terms of piling more subsidy spending and more debt finance spending into the United States economy.